In the middle of a winter storm, a former Navy SEAL spotted something moving beneath the black water. When his boat rose on the next wave, he saw a German shepherd struggling desperately to keep its head above the water. He steered carefully into the wind, threw out a life ring, and pulled the exhausted dog toward the hull. But once aboard, the freezing dog refused to rest and kept staring toward the dark sea. A brass tag revealed that the dog belonged to a fisherman who had vanished 10 days earlier near Morrow Rock. Why had the German shepherd risked everything to return to the water? And what was still waiting beyond the storm? Where are you watching from today? Stay with us until the end, then tell us what this story meant to you. Please like, share, and subscribe as we work toward welcoming our first 1,000 subscribers. North Glass Sound was nearly invisible beneath the snow. Wet flakes struck the windshield of Rowan Keel's service boat. Beyond the glass, the cold northern water rose like black iron. The harbor lights of Driftwood Reach, a small village built against the cliffs of a remote island, appeared for a second, then vanished behind another wall of spray. Rowan was 47, a former Navy SEAL who now repaired mooring buoys, carried supplies, and helped with coastal rescues. That night, his only goal was to bring the boat home after securing a channel buoy whose chain had snapped in the storm. He understood rough water. He also understood the danger of believing skill could control it. Years earlier, Rowan had withdrawn from a search after his teammate, Evan Cade, disappeared during a mission. The order had been necessary. A weak signal recorded hours later had never been confirmed. Rowan had carried the unfinished question ever since. He trusted facts, because facts did not ask a man to hope past reason. The boat climbed a steep swell. Something dark appeared in the forward light, then vanished. A loose net, Rowan thought. The next wave lifted the boat. 2 pointed ears rose beside an overturned skiff. A German shepherd was fighting to keep his muzzle above the water. Rowan did not drive straight toward him. The propeller could turn a rescue into another loss. He moved upwind, reduced speed, and circled until the waves would carry a line toward the dog. "Stay with me," Rowan said, though the wind took the words. He secured himself to the rail and threw a life ring beyond the animal. The first cast landed too far left. The second drifted within reach. The dog caught the rope instead of the ring. His grip was weak, but deliberate. Rowan fed the line through the manual winch and pulled slowly. Too fast, and the dog might lose his hold. Too slow, and the cold would finish what the waves had started. The dog's jaws slipped once, then he bit down again. "One more minute," Rowan said. The words were for both of them. When the dog reached the hull, Rowan lowered a rescue sling, worked it beneath his chest, and raised him onto the deck. Water ran from the black and tan coat. The dog's ribs moved quickly beneath the wet fur. Rowan expected him to collapse under the console. Instead, the German shepherd tried to stand. His legs shook, but he moved to the outer rail, placed both front paws against the metal, and stared into the black water. A low sound rose from his throat, not a bark, not fear. It sounded like protest. Rowan caught the sling before the dog could fall. "There's nothing you can do out there." The dog kept looking into the storm. Rowan checked the dark teal collar. A brass tag hung beneath the buckle. Tiller Nolan Voss, East Shore, Driftwood Reach. Rowan knew Nolan Voss by sight. Everyone on the island knew the 53-year-old marine mechanic who repaired engines. Others had declared useless. Rowan also knew Nolan had been missing for more than a week. The harbor lights returned through the snow. This time, Rowan aimed directly for them. Maren Cole, Driftwood Reach's 64-year-old harbor master, waited at the service berth in a faded yellow oilskin coat. Rowan threw her the stern line, then pointed toward the deck. Maren's expression changed when she saw the dog. "Tiller." The German shepherd lifted his head. Maren climbed aboard, and studied the soaked collar and trembling legs without crowding him. "Nolan's dog," Rowan said. Maren nodded. "Nolan Voss has been missing for 10 days. While Rowan wrapped Tiller in wool blankets, Maren explained. Nolan had left Driftwood Reach to inspect an offshore storm station before the first winter freeze. His damaged boat had been found near Blackfin Shelf, a submerged line of rock along the western side of Morrow Rock. No one had been aboard. Search crews worked for 3 days, covering the water around the boat and the routes leading home. Heavy seas and fog kept them from reaching Morrow Rock's sheltered side. Then 2 more storms arrived, and Maren signed the order suspending the search. Her voice remained practical, but she kept one hand closed around the dock line. Rowan asked how Tiller had reached the open water. Edith Voss, Nolan's 79-year-old aunt, had been caring for the dog at Nolan's East Shore home. Since Nolan vanished, Tiller had gone to the same mooring post every morning and watched the sea. That night, Tiller broke through the yard gate and climbed into the small skiff Nolan often used with him. The wind tore it loose before anyone noticed. It overturned beyond the inner harbor. "He wasn't trying to swim to Morrow Rock," Maren said. "He followed something familiar, and the storm took the choice away." Rowan understood. Loyalty could guide a creature. It could also carry one too far. The eastern road was icing over, so Rowan took Tiller to his cabin above the lower harbor. He turned up the iron stove, spread towels beside it, and examined the dog. No serious injury, only cold, exhaustion, and a body lighter than it should have been beneath the thick coat. Rowan dried Tiller's ears, chest, and paws, then set down a shallow bowl of lukewarm water. Tiller watched him. The dog did not drink until Rowan stepped back. Later, Rowan offered warmed whitefish and rice. Again, Tiller waited. "Go ahead," Rowan said. Only then did the dog eat. There was no frantic swallowing or search for more. When he finished, Tiller chose a place where he could see the front door, the narrow window, and Rowan's chair. A working position. Rowan sat across from him, turning the wooden folding rule he always carried between his fingers. He had seen trained rescue dogs hold rooms that way. They did not merely rest. They arranged themselves around responsibility. But training proved only that someone had taught Tiller what to do. It did not prove Nolan was alive. Rowan repeated the thought until it sounded less like reason and more like defense. Near dawn, the storm weakened. Snow brushed the window. The stove settled into a low orange glow. For a while, Tiller slept. Then the old fog bell near the harbor moved in the wind. 3 short notes crossed the dark. Tiller stood before the last note faded, his ears angled forward. He looked toward the window, then at Rowan. Rowan expected him to pull toward the sea. Tiller went to the door. He waited beside the leash until Rowan clipped it to the collar, then led him uphill, not toward the harbor, but east, along the snow-covered lane. The dog moved with purpose, stopping twice to make sure Rowan followed. The path ended at Nolan Voss's dark workshop near the eastern shore. Edith Voss arrived several minutes later in a navy peacoat, her silver hair pinned beneath a gray wool hat. She carried a pale wooden cane and the workshop key. Edith did not ask Rowan whether he believed Nolan was alive. She looked at Tiller and opened the door. Inside, the air smelled of cold metal, machine oil, and cedar shavings. Tiller passed the workbench and ignored the hanging coats. He stopped before a low tool cabinet and ran his nose along the wooden edge. Then he sat in front of the third drawer. Rowan placed his hand on the small lock. Something metallic shifted inside. Edith stared at the drawer. For the first time, her composure weakened. Nolan did not want anyone opening that after Lydia died, Edith said. But if Tiller brought you here, perhaps Nolan left. Her voice stopped. Beyond the workshop walls, the sea moved under the snow. carrying the unfinished sentence into morning. The metal sound inside the drawer was small, but it changed the room. Rowan Keel kept one hand on the lock, while Edith Voss stood beside him, her pale wooden cane resting against the workbench. Tiller remained seated in front of the cabinet, his wet nose close to the narrow seam. Outside Nolan Voss's workshop, snow moved past the windows in thin white lines. Inside, the air held the old smells of engine oil, cedar dust, and cold iron. Edith removed a second key from beneath her coat. "Nolan gave me this years ago," she explained. "He said it was for emergencies. Then he spent the next 10 years acting as if emergencies only happened to other people." Her tone was dry, but Rowan saw the strain in her hand as she placed the key in the lock. The drawer opened with a wooden scrape. Inside lay a folded nautical chart, a brass whistle darkened by age, several receipts, a boxed emergency battery, and a list of tools written in Nolan's square handwriting. Beneath those items rested a narrow copper tube, no longer than Rowan's palm. The tube carried one stamped marking, MIMSR3. Tiller rose, sniffed the brass whistle, then turned toward a faded canvas jacket hanging from the side of the cabinet. The jacket smelled faintly of fuel, salt, and the man who had worn it. The dog pressed his nose to one sleeve. Then he sat again. He did not paw at the chart or point toward any place drawn on it. He had brought them to familiar objects. What those objects meant was now a human responsibility. Rowan unfolded the chart across the workbench. The official route to the offshore storm station had been traced in dark pencil. A second, much fainter line curved away from that route and continued around Blackfin Shelf toward the northeast side of Morrow Rock. Beside the line, Nolan had written, MR3. Check stove, water tank, and hand transmitter before first freeze. Rowan read it twice. The route did not appear on the voyage plan Maren Cole had shown the search team. Nolan had intended to make another stop and had told no one. Edith touched the brass whistle with one finger. "That belonged to Lydia," she said. Lydia Voss had been Nolan's wife. She had died 6 years earlier after a brief illness. Rowan had known the fact in the shallow way island communities knew the important losses of people they did not visit. He had not known about the whistle. Edith explained that Lydia had once helped Nolan maintain the older coastal shelters. In heavy fog, Nolan would sound 3 short notes when his boat entered the eastern channel. It meant only one thing: I'm still here. After Lydia died, Nolan kept using the signal. Tiller learned to recognize it and would wait by the east window before Nolan's boat appeared. The fog bell had repeated the same rhythm in the wind that morning. Tiller had not received a message from the sea. He had heard an old pattern and followed it to the place where Nolan prepared for his journeys. The explanation made the dog's behavior more ordinary. It also made it more meaningful. Rowan lifted the copper tube. The cap had been sealed with wax, but age had loosened it. Inside was a small iron key wrapped in oiled cloth. Edith recognized it at once. "The spare key to shelter number 3, she said. "Lydia kept it here. Nolan carried the working key on his boat." That solved one question and opened another. If Nolan had reached Morrow Rock, he could have entered the shelter. Rowan turned to the receipts. Nolan had purchased enough fuel for the official trip to the storm station and several additional hours on the water. He had also bought heating oil, insulated wire, fuses, and a separate VHF battery. The battery in the drawer was still sealed. Rowan checked the purchase list and found 2 batteries recorded. Nolan had taken the other one. This was an accidental idea marked on an old map. Nolan had prepared to visit Morrow Rock. Edith moved closer to the chart. The council removed that shelter from the maintenance list 8 years ago. Morrow Rock had once held 3 stone shelters for fishermen caught beyond the main island. 2 had collapsed after years of winter storms. The third stood inside a narrow protected cove on the northeast side. Few boats used that passage anymore. Modern engines were faster, radios were better, and the village had decided that maintaining the shelter cost more than its value. Nolan had disagreed. According to Edith, he often said a roof did not become useless simply because no one had needed it lately. A dry stove, a water tank, and a working signal could still mean the difference between a bad night and a final one. He believed abandoned things deserved one honest inspection before people forgot them, Edith said. Rowan looked around the workshop. Nolan's tools were arranged by use, not appearance. Broken parts waited in labeled boxes. Old engines stood beneath canvas covers instead of being discarded. The shelter on Morrow Rock fit the man. So did the unfiled route. The discovery should have felt hopeful. Instead, Rowan felt the old pressure beneath his ribs. A map could become dangerous when a man needed it to say more than it did. Years earlier, in a place far from Driftwood Reach, Rowan had listened to Evan Cade through a damaged radio. Evan had been separated from the team after weather, and terrain broke their line of movement. The final clear words had been, "There's another way past the—" Static swallowed the rest. Rowan never learned whether Evan meant another road, another ridge, another person, or nothing useful at all. For years, Rowan's mind had finished the sentence in different ways. Every ending led back to the same question. Had there been one more route? Tiller moved closer and sat against Rowan's boot. The dog did not whine or demand attention. His warm shoulder simply touched Rowan's leg. Rowan folded one section of the chart, then opened it again. He told himself what the map proved. Nolan had intended to visit Morrow Rock. Nothing more. It did not prove he reached it. It did not prove he survived the wreck. And it did not give Rowan permission to turn an old failure into a new mission. Edith watched him with the patience of someone who had spent years tending lights for people she would never meet. "You do not have to decide anything this morning," she said. Rowan looked toward her. "You want me to go?" Edith did not pretend otherwise, but she refused to make her grief his command. "I want the truth," she replied. "I am old enough to know that the truth does not always bring someone home." That answer unsettled Rowan more than pleading would have. Faith, he had learned, was often mistaken for certainty. But Edith possessed no certainty. She simply refused to close a door while a fact remained outside it. Rowan rolled the chart carefully and asked Edith to contact Hollis Dane. Hollis arrived less than an hour later. The 76-year-old retired fisherman was tall, but slightly bent through the shoulders, with a long, weathered face and a white mustache. He wore an oatmeal-colored fisherman's sweater beneath a faded green canvas coat. In one hand, he carried a walking stick made from driftwood, its surface marked with old tide levels. Hollis did not offer encouragement when he saw the map. He studied it. Using the end of his stick, he traced Blackfin Shelf across the workshop floor before moving the tip around an imaginary point. "People speak of Blackfin and Morrow Rock as if they are separate," Hollis explained. "They are not. Blackfin is the western shelf of the same rock formation. The damaged boat had been found on that western side. The shelter cove lay less than half a nautical mile away on the northeast face. Under ordinary conditions, the water pushed away from the cove, but during a northeast wind, followed by a hard turn in the tide, the current could divide around the shelf. A boat without control might be carried back toward the western rocks. A person wearing a flotation coat could be drawn through the northern channel and into the quieter water beyond it. Hollis made no promise that Nolan had followed that current. He only showed that it was possible. The first search had concentrated on the boat, the western rocks, and the open water leading toward Driftwood Reach. Fog and heavy swells prevented crews from circling close enough to inspect the sheltered cove from the north. No one had entered it. Rowan looked at the map again. The search had not failed to find Nolan everywhere. It had failed to reach the one place that might have protected him. Tiller lowered himself beside the workbench. His eyes moved between Rowan, Edith, and Hollis, but he remained still. Rowan asked Hollis whether a fire or signal from the shelter could be seen from Blackfin's shelf. Hollis pointed to the steep northern wall of Morrow Rock. If Nolan reached that cove, anyone searching from the west would never see a flame, a flag, or smoke. The rock would hide all of it. The workshop became quiet. Snow tapped the eastern window. Somewhere beneath the floor, an old pipe gave a soft knock as the temperature changed. Rowan looked at the unopened emergency battery on the bench. Then what about the radio? Edith followed his gaze. Nolan had purchased 2 batteries. One remained in the drawer. The other had left Driftwood Reach with him. If Nolan reached the shelter, he might have tried to power a transmitter the entire island believed had been silent for years. By noon, the chart from Nolan Voss's workshop lay beneath the yellow lights of the Driftwood Reach Community Hall. Snow covered the village outside. It softened the roofs, buried the ropes coiled beside the harbor, and turned the boats pulled onto shore into white shapes against the cliffs. Inside, nearly 30 island residents sat on folding chairs or stood along the paneled walls. They had not gathered to decide whether they cared about Nolan. They had gathered to decide how much risk caring was allowed to create. Maren Cole stood at the head of the long table with her dented aluminum clipboard. As harbor master, she controlled the island's fuel reserve, approved departures during dangerous weather, and carried the responsibility for every boat that did not return when expected. She had written 4 figures on a chalkboard. The clinic generator required enough fuel to survive another week of unstable power. A shipment of medicine had to be collected from the mainland. The island's next food delivery was due in 2 days. A final portion had to remain untouched in case a new emergency occurred before the harbor reopened fully. What remained after those needs was not enough for an open-ended search. A fisherman near the back of the room said Tiller was repeating an old routine. The German shepherd had waited for Nolan every morning, listened for 3 short notes, and followed familiar smells. None of that proved a man had survived 10 winter nights. A woman whose husband worked the supply boat asked what would happen if they spent their reserve looking for Nolan and the clinic lost power during the next storm. Another resident said Edith Voss needed kindness, not another reason to postpone grief. The words were not cruel. That made them harder to dismiss. Most people in the room had known Nolan for years. He had repaired their engines, patched their heaters, and arrived with tools when a generator failed after midnight. Yet affection could not create fuel, calm the sea, or make one life worth risking several others without a plan. Edith sat near the end of the table in a navy coat, her silver lighthouse pin fastened at the collar. She allowed the discussion to continue without interrupting. Tiller lay beside her chair. Rowan Keel stood near the wall, with his hands resting loosely at his sides. He had expected resistance. What he had not expected was how familiar the room would feel. Different place, different faces. Same terrible arithmetic. How many hours remained? How much weather could a team absorb? At what point did searching for one person begin endangering the people still within reach? Years earlier, those questions had ended the search for Evan Cade. Rowan had obeyed the order to withdraw. No honest man could say the decision had been careless. Conditions had collapsed, communication had failed, and the remaining team had been losing its own route home. Still, one weak signal had appeared later. The memory had turned every necessary limit into something that felt like betrayal. Edith finally rose. She did not lean on the table or ask anyone to picture Nolan cold and alone. She did not remind them of every unpaid repair he had completed, or every winter night he had answered a call. She unfolded the old chart and placed it where everyone could see. "I am not asking anyone here to believe Nolan is alive," Edith said. "I am asking you to confirm that the place most capable of keeping him alive was actually searched. The room grew quieter. Edith pointed to Blackfin's shelf, where Nolan's damaged boat had been found, then to the sheltered northeastern cove of Morrow Rock. She explained that the search teams had covered the western water and the route back to Driftwood Reach. Heavy waves and fog prevented them from reaching the cove directly. The newly discovered route on Nolan's chart showed that he had intended to stop at Shelter, MR3. Hollis Dane added the information about the divided current. The retired fisherman stood slowly, his long frame bent at the shoulders, but his voice still steady. Using his driftwood cane, he traced the western shelf, the northern channel, and the quieter water beyond the rock. He did not claim Nolan had been carried there. He said only that the possibility had not been disproved. Maren listened with both hands against her clipboard. When the room turned toward her, she explained why she had suspended the first search. The seas had risen beyond the operating limit. One rescue boat had developed steering trouble. Fuel reserves were falling. No confirmed signal had come from Nolan's radio. I made the decision using the weather, the boat's location, and everything we knew, Maren said. She stopped. Her gaze moved to the map. But what I didn't know was... The unfinished sentence remained between them. Rowan understood the burden in it. Maren had made a necessary decision. Since then, she had been treating necessity like a verdict on her character. Rowan had done the same thing for years. A man could survive a hard choice and still spend the rest of his life putting himself on trial for it. The meeting became louder again. One resident asked whether the island should risk 2 boats for a route drawn in pencil. Another asked whether Rowan intended to take Tiller into winter seas because the dog reacted to a whistle. Tiller lifted his head when he heard his name. Edith's canvas tool bag rested beside her chair. The brass whistle Lydia once carried had been placed inside after they left Nolan's workshop. Tiller rose, lowered his nose into the open bag, and carefully took the leather cord between his teeth. He crossed the room. People stopped speaking as the German shepherd approached Rowan and placed the whistle on the floor before his boots. Then Tiller sat. He did not turn toward the door. He did not pull Rowan toward the harbor or bark at the windows. He waited. Rowan looked down at the old whistle. Until that moment, part of him had treated loyalty as a force that could only move forward. Stay longer. Search farther. Refuse every ending. But Tiller had already tried blind motion once. He had climbed into Nolan's skiff, and the storm had nearly taken him. Now the dog had brought the familiar object to people who could weigh what it meant. Loyalty had not disappeared. It had learned restraint. Rowan picked up the whistle and set it on the map. "If we go," he said, "we do not go, because the dog wants us to." The room settled enough for him to continue. Rowan proposed a search with a fixed 6-hour operating window. 2 boats would travel together. The fuel allocated to the clinic, medicine run, and food shipment would remain untouched. Each vessel would carry enough to return, plus a protected reserve that could not be used to extend the search. Radio checks would occur every 15 minutes. The team would establish a mandatory turnaround coordinate before departure. If they reached it after the agreed time, they would return regardless of what they hoped might lie beyond it. The larger boats would remain outside the narrow cove. A rigid rescue skiff would be carried for the final approach. It had room for 4 adults and equipment without overloading. They would prepare for Nolan to be unable to walk. A soft stretcher, lifting straps, thermal blankets, first aid supplies, spare flotation equipment, and hot fluids would be loaded before departure. Tiller could come because his hearing and knowledge of Nolan might be useful. But the dog would wear an insulated flotation vest, a working harness, and a separate safety line at all times. Rowan made the final condition plain. "No course change happens because Tiller looks in a direction," he said. "We confirm it with current, sound, a visible mark, or another piece of evidence." The plan did not promise Nolan would be found. It promised the search would not become another disappearance. Claire Arden joined the meeting through the harbor station's wall speaker. The 50-year-old coastal rescue commander was waiting at the mainland base with a crew and equipment. Her low, even voice carried through the room without strain. Claire agreed that the route justified a limited operation. She also placed one condition of her own. Rowan would not command the scene. Claire would hold authority to turn both boats around. She would decide whether the cove was safe to approach and whether any signal justified further exposure. Rowan felt the old resistance rise before Claire finished speaking. He knew the water around Driftwood Reach better than the mainland crew. He knew his own boat, tiller, and the cost of leaving a search unfinished. Those were reasons to contribute. They were not reasons to control everything. Rowan accepted Claire's authority. Claire remained silent for a moment before addressing him directly. "You are not going to Morrow Rock to prove that this time you will stay until the end," she said. "You are going to inspect one location, during one weather window, under a plan that gives everyone a reasonable chance to come home." Rowan looked at the whistle on the chart. Claire had named the danger more accurately than anyone else in the room. Rowan was not only investigating Nolan's route. Some part of him wanted to return to the unfinished sentence Evan had left behind and force a different ending upon it. That part of him could come aboard. It could not take the wheel. While Marin recalculated the available fuel, the harbor office connected Grant Sutter from the mainland communications center. Grant appeared on a small wall monitor beneath the emergency clock. He was a thin, 57-year-old technician with a high forehead, salt and pepper hair, and rectangular dark-framed glasses. A pair of orange hearing protectors rested around his neck. He spoke carefully, as though every word should survive inspection. After receiving the MR3 identification from Edith, Grant searched the archived emergency traffic recorded on the morning after Nolan disappeared. The Morrow Rock shelter had been classified as inactive for 8 years. Its identification code remained in the system, but automated software separated any incoming traffic from retired stations into a low-priority file. Grant found 2 entries. Each contained 3 brief VHF carrier pulses. The transmissions were weak, without voice or location data. The computer labeled them unreliable reflections from inactive equipment. Because the active search was concentrated near Blackfin's shelf, no operator reopened the file. Grant could not say Nolan had sent them. He could say the transmitter at MR3 had received power that night. A person had connected a battery, pressed the transmit switch, or activated the unit in some other deliberate way. Old equipment did not produce 2 ordered sequences by itself, simply because a storm passed over it. The argument in the hall changed after that. No one declared Nolan alive. No one called the signal a miracle. The question was no longer whether Edith's hope deserved to be indulged. The question was whether a real location, an unsearched shelter, and a recorded transmission deserved 6 controlled hours. Marin approved the fuel release. Not all of it. Not enough to chase uncertainty across the whole sound. Enough to inspect Morrow Rock and return. Grant sent the original audio file through the harbor system. 3 faint pulses filled the hall. A pause followed. Then 3 more. The second series did not end cleanly. After the final short pulse came a thin, extended carrier tone, uneven and fading, as though someone had continued pressing the transmitter after the power began to fail. No voice emerged, only effort. Claire checked the latest ice forecast, while the last tone dissolved into static. "We have 1 opening tomorrow morning," she said. "After that, the cove may be blocked for at least 3 days." Outside, snow continued to settle over the harbor. Inside, the people of Driftwood Reach stopped arguing about whether hope was wise. They began preparing to give it boundaries. Driftwood Reach disappeared behind Rowan Keel before the sun rose. Fresh snow covered the village roofs, the church steps, and the boats pulled high above the winter tide. From the harbor, the island looked quiet enough to be sleeping. Only the yellow lamps along the dock and the low pulse of 2 engines showed that anyone was awake. Rowan stood at the controls of his service boat in a faded navy deck coat and charcoal waterproof overalls. Hollis Dane sat behind him, one gloved hand resting on his driftwood cane. The old fisherman had spent nearly 60 years reading North Glass Sound, but age and stiff joints meant he would remain aboard during any landing. Tiller stood on the center deck. The German Shepherd wore an insulated gray body layer beneath a brick-orange flotation vest. A black working harness secured him to a safety line running along the deck rail. His right ear leaned slightly outward in the wind, while his left remained fixed toward the dark water ahead. Claire Arden's rescue vessel followed 50 yards behind. A rigid rescue skiff was secured to its stern platform. Soft stretchers, lifting straps, blankets, medical supplies, and spare flotation equipment had been loaded before departure. Nothing had been left to hope. The search window was 6 hours. Their turnaround time had been written down before the first engine started. The clinic fuel remained on the island. The supply reserve had not been touched. Rowan repeated those facts silently as the boats cleared the eastern headland. This was not a promise to bring Nolan Voss home. It was a controlled inspection of one place no one had reached. North Glass Sound opened before them in steel-blue water, broken by drifting plates of thin ice. The storm had moved east, but its weight remained in the swell. Each rise lifted Rowan's boat toward a pale strip of morning sky, then lowered it between dark walls of water. Hollis watched the surface rather than the horizon. The old man pointed out the narrow lines where currents met. Foam gathered in one direction, while small pieces of ice turned another. To an inexperienced eye, the water looked confused. To Hollis, every movement belonged to a larger pattern. Blackfin Shelf appeared shortly after sunrise. At low tide, several dark teeth of rock broke through the surface. Beneath them stretched a submerged ridge along the western side of Morrow Rock. It was there that Nolan's damaged boat had been found. Claire ordered both vessels to reduce speed. The crews searched the rocks, the water between them, and the narrow channels where wreckage might collect. A young rescue technician aboard Claire's boat noticed the wood first. The broken plank drifted against a patch of ice near the shelf. Its paint was dark blue beneath the salt crust, the same color Nolan had used on the upper rail of his boat. Claire's crew lifted it from the water with a boathook. Della Rusk, a 39-year-old rescue specialist with a compact build and a calm, practical manner, examined the plank on the rear deck. She reported that one edge had been freshly split during the wreck, but the piece had spent days moving through the water. The discovery still pulled Rowan's attention toward Blackfin. Visible evidence had weight. A man could touch painted wood. He could point to it and say Nolan's boat had been there. The northeastern cove remained only a line on an old chart. Tiller stood with his nose lifted toward the north. The dog did not strain against the harness. He simply held his head in one direction and tested the wind. Rowan noticed, but he did not change course. Instead, he brought his boat close enough for Della to pass the plank across. Rowan set it on the work surface beside the controls and examined it. Salt had dried more heavily along one face. Tiny shell growth had begun near the lower edge. The blue paint was faded unevenly, showing that the plank had rolled and drifted rather than remaining fixed at the shelf. Rowan checked the current time against Nolan's tide table. Hollis leaned forward and traced the broken edge with one finger. The boat did not stay where Nolan left it, Hollis said. Not in that wind. The old fisherman explained the sequence slowly enough for everyone listening by radio to follow. On the night Nolan vanished, the wind had driven hard from the northeast. Near midnight, the tide turned. Water split around Blackfin Shelf, with the upper layer pushing damaged objects back toward the western rocks. A person in a flotation coat, lower in the water and caught between two submerged ridges, could have followed a different pull through the northern channel. Nolan and his boat did not need to travel together after the wreck. The plank proved where part of the boat had gone. It did not prove where Nolan had gone. Rowan looked at Tiller. The German Shepherd still faced north. Claire's voice came through the radio, clear and controlled. She approved the turn only after Hollis's current reading matched the route marked on Nolan's chart. The two vessels moved around the northern face of Morrow Rock. The island rose from the sea like the back of some buried animal. Black stone showed beneath snow, steep enough that almost nothing grew there. Wind drove loose powder from the upper ledges and cast it over the water in white veils. Radio reception weakened as the rock blocked the mainland repeater. Claire ordered the boats to remain within direct sight of one another. If radio contact failed completely, hand signals and horn codes would be used. Rowan reduced speed. The northern wall passed on his left. Every dark break in the stone resembled an opening until the angle changed and exposed solid rock behind it. Tiller suddenly stood taller. His body remained balanced, but his ears shifted toward a section of cliff ahead. He glanced at Rowan, then returned his attention to the rock. Rowan felt his own pulse change. He did not trust the feeling. He checked the depth sounder, the chart, and the movement of ice near the cliff. Hollis confirmed that they were approaching the area where the sheltered channel should begin. Tiller's head turned slightly. Rowan lowered the throttle. The dog did not look away. "Engines idle," Rowan said over the radio. 10 seconds. Claire repeated the instruction to both crews. The engines dropped to a low vibration and then fell silent. Without them, the sea became louder. Small ice plates tapped the hull. A loose cable knocked once against Claire's stern rail. Wind moved over the upper rock with a deep hollow sound. Rowan held up one hand. Then came 3 weak metallic notes. They were distant, thin, and nearly swallowed by the water. No one spoke. Several seconds passed. 3 more notes reached them. Della checked every loose tool and rail fitting aboard the rescue vessel. Rowan did the same on his boat. Claire confirmed that the sound had not come from either craft. Tiller remained fixed toward the cliff. Rowan's mind returned to another broken signal from another time. "There's another way past the..." For one dangerous second, the years folded together. His hands felt too cold on the controls. The rocks ahead became another place he had failed to reach. The 6-hour limit became an enemy. Claire's authority became the voice that might order him to leave again. Then Rowan looked at the chart. He had a marked route. He had 2 boats. He had a rescue commander, medical equipment, fuel to return, and a defined point beyond which they would not continue. The past had offered him none of those things. His body remembered the same fear, but the facts were different. God did not always remove the dark water. Sometimes grace arrived as enough light to take the next honest step without pretending the whole sea was safe. Rowan restarted the engine. They followed the sound to a narrow break in the stone. From the open water, it appeared too small to hold a cove. Only when the boats reached the correct angle did the channel open behind a black shoulder of rock. Inside, the water was calmer. It was not safe. Ice moved through the entrance, and submerged stone showed just beneath the surface. The larger boats would have little room to turn if the current changed. Claire refused to take either vessel farther. The decision came immediately, before excitement could replace judgment. The rescue skiff was lowered from Claire's stern platform. Della joined Rowan for the landing. Hollis remained aboard Rowan's boat, where his knowledge would still guide the approach and departure. Claire stayed outside the channel to coordinate both vessels and watch the ice movement. Rowan transferred the equipment into the skiff: a soft stretcher, 2 lifting straps, a medical bag, thermal blankets, hot fluid packs, a spare radio and signal light. Tiller stepped into the skiff only after Rowan gave the command. His harness remained attached to a short safety line fixed near the center bench. Della took the forward position, while Rowan controlled the outboard motor. They entered the channel slowly. Snow covered the ledges near the shore. The protected cove curved inward behind the cliff, invisible from Blackfin's shelf. At its far end stood a low stone shelter pressed against the rock. A narrow chimney rose from the roof. Something red moved against it. Della lifted her binoculars. A strip of cloth, she reported, tied near the chimney cap. It was not old enough to have survived years of weather. The red remained visible beneath the frost, and one loose end moved whenever the wind reached into the cove. Rowan felt hope rise before he could stop it. He gave it no name. The skiff touched the narrow stone landing. Della stepped out first and secured the bowline. Rowan followed, then brought Tiller onto the snow-covered ground. Several marks crossed the white surface near the shelter. A single boot print, then another. Beside them ran a broad drag line, as though someone had pulled one leg or an object behind them. Wind had softened the edges, but fresh snow had not filled them. The marks could not have survived 10 days. Someone had come outside that morning. Tiller lowered his nose to the drag line. He followed it for several feet toward the open edge of the cove, then stopped. The German shepherd lifted his head, turned away from the drop, and moved toward the shelter door. He did not pull Rowan. He chose the direction and waited for Rowan to follow. They reached the stone wall. The red cloth moved above them. From inside came 3 slow knocks. Rowan placed one hand on the door. For a moment, nothing followed. Then a man's voice, thin with cold and distance, passed through the wood. "Tiller! Tiller!" The voice behind the shelter door was weak, but it belonged to a living man. Rowan Keel pushed the wooden latch inward. The door resisted where ice had gathered along the frame. Della Rusk braced one shoulder beside him, and together they forced it open far enough to enter. Warmth did not meet them. The stone shelter was only less cold than the cove outside. A small oil stove burned near the rear wall, its flame low and uneven. Meltwater had darkened the floor around a metal pot. A red strip had been torn from an old cloth and tied to a length of wire leading toward the chimney. Nolan Voss sat on a folded blanket beside the stove. 10 days had changed him. His copper-brown hair had flattened against his forehead, and his thick mustache had grown into the gray stubble covering his cheeks. The yellow oilskin coat he had worn to sea hung loosely around his shoulders. One trouser leg had been cut open above a swollen ankle wrapped in strips of cloth. His face was pale beneath the redness left by wind and cold. But his green-gray eyes were clear. Rowan had seen men alive in worse places. He had also seen men who looked stronger and had already begun slipping away. Della moved first, kneeling beside Nolan with the medical bag. She identified herself, checked his awareness, and asked simple questions about the date, his breathing, and the pain in his leg. Nolan answered each one correctly, though every sentence cost him breath. Tiller remained at the doorway. For 10 days, the German shepherd had waited at Nolan's mooring post, searched familiar rooms, followed 3-note signals, and nearly lost his own life trying to reach the sea. Now that Nolan was only a few steps away, Tiller did not rush him. Rowan unclipped the short line from the door ring, but kept hold of it. "Easy," Rowan said. Tiller approached slowly. He smelled Nolan's boots first, then the hand resting beside the blanket. Nolan lifted his fingers, but he did not call the dog closer. Tiller made the final choice himself. He stepped between Della and the stove, lowered his head, and pressed it against Nolan's chest. The shelter became still. Tiller did not lick Nolan's face or paw at him. The dog held his body against the old oilskin coat, as though listening through layers of cloth, cold, and time. Nolan's hand settled over the back of Tiller's neck. "I thought you would—" His voice failed before the sentence did. tiller remained in place. Then, beneath Nolan's hand, the tension left the dog's shoulders. His eyes closed. A long breath moved through his body. He had found the rhythm he had been waiting for. Not a whistle, not a boat engine, a heartbeat. Rowan looked away for a moment and checked the shelter instead. It was practical habit, but it was also mercy. Some reunions deserved privacy, even when 3 other people stood inside the room. Della found no sign of a severe medical emergency requiring treatment beyond their equipment. Nolan was dehydrated, underfed, exhausted, and unable to place full weight on the injured ankle. His temperature was low, but stable enough for controlled evacuation. She gave him warm fluid in small amounts, while Rowan examined the remains of his supplies. A waterproof emergency bag lay open beside the wall. Nolan had brought medicine, matches, a thermal blanket, and 4 days of ration bars. Every wrapper had been folded flat and stacked instead of discarded. I cut each ration into thirds, Nolan explained. Did the same with the biscuits. The shelter's original emergency cabinet had contained 1 sealed tin of hard biscuits. They were old, dry, and unpleasant, but the inner seal remained intact. A stone collection tank beneath the roof still held rainwater. Nolan had boiled what he could and melted fresh snow when the tank ran low. The heating oil had come from his own boat. He had intended to service the stove before winter, so he carried more than he would normally need for a day trip. Everything that kept him alive had been there for a reason. No single miracle waited inside the shelter. There was preparation, restraint, an old roof no one had repaired recently, and enough grace in those ordinary things to carry a man through one more night. Rowan found the hand transmitter near the chimney. Its casing had been opened and placed on a folded rag. New wire connected the battery compartment to the replacement power pack Nolan had brought from Driftwood Reach. A scorched circuit near the transmitter switch explained why it no longer worked. Nolan had reached the shelter shortly before dawn on the first night. He had been circling Blackfin Shelf toward Morrow Rock when a breaking wave drove his boat against submerged rock. The hull remained afloat, but the steering failed, and water entered near the stern. Nolan was already wearing his flotation coat. When another wave crossed the deck, it carried him over the side. The current pulled him between 2 sections of the shelf. He remembered striking loose ice, losing sight of the boat, and being carried toward quieter water. He reached the cove by following the dark line of the cliff and used the working key from his coat to open shelter MR3. His boat did not sink immediately. Without anyone controlling it, wind and the turning tide pushed it back toward the western shelf, where the search crew later found it. The explanation matched Hollis Dane's reading of the current. Nolan had not vanished from the place where the boat was discovered. He and the boat had separated before they reached it. On his first night in the shelter, Nolan installed the new battery and activated the VHF transmitter. He sent 2 sets of 3 short carrier pulses before the old circuit overheated. The switch stuck after the second set, Nolan said. I held it down, hoping someone might see the carrier stay open. Then the board went dark. That was the long fading signal Grant Sutter had recovered. Afterward, Nolan used a strip of metal from the stove shield to strike the chimney whenever he heard an engine through the rock. Most sounds faded before he could be sure they were real. That morning, he heard the rescue boats. He dragged himself outside, tied the red cloth near the chimney, and tried to reach a higher ledge. The injured ankle failed after only a few yards. The boot prints and drag marks belonged to that attempt. Della tightened the support around Nolan's ankle, while Rowan studied the man beside the stove. You should have filed the Morrow Rock route, Rowan said. His voice remained level, but anger had already entered it. Nolan looked down at Tiller, who now lay close beside his uninjured leg. Maren would have stopped me. She would have made you take another person. She would have called the shelter closed and told me to leave it that way. Rowan glanced toward the repaired stove, the water tank, and the ruined transmitter. And because you did not want an argument, 30 people searched the wrong side of the rock. Nolan's face tightened. He explained that people had started speaking to him differently after Lydia died. They checked whether he had eaten, questioned every winter trip, and treated any risk he accepted as proof that grief had made him incapable of judgment. He was 53, not helpless. Morrow Rock had needed work. Nolan knew the machines, the route, and the weather window. He had believed that should have been enough. It nearly was, Nolan said. Rowan felt his anger sharpen. Nearly is what people say when someone else has to come finish the job. Della stopped packing the medical bag for half a second. Tiller raised his head, but remained beside Nolan. Nolan studied Rowan more carefully. The mechanic was weak, but he had not lost the habit of listening for what an engine concealed beneath its obvious noise. "You are not only angry because I came alone," Nolan said. "You are angry because I was found." The words entered quietly. They struck harder for that reason. Rowan saw Evan Cade as he had last known him, not as a casualty report or an unfinished transmission, but as a man turning his collar against the rain, saying there was another way before static swallowed the rest. Nolan had survived the route no one searched. Evan had not been found. A bitter part of Rowan wanted the difference to mean something about his own past. Another part resented Nolan for standing as proof that sometimes one more route mattered. Rowan could not answer him. Claire's voice broke through the portable radio. The ice field outside the cove had changed direction. A broad plate was moving toward the entrance, pushed by the outer current. Claire estimated that they had 40 minutes before the safe width of the channel became too narrow for the skiff. The room's emotional weight became secondary to the clock. Della began preparing the lifting straps. Nolan pushed one hand against the floor. "I can walk." He managed to rise halfway before pain drained the color from his face. Rowan caught his arm but did not force him back down immediately. Nolan's wish was not foolish in itself. He wanted to leave the shelter on his own feet, because 10 days of waiting had already taken enough control from him. But Nolan's body had limits that pride could not negotiate away. Rowan had limits too. He could take command of every movement, reduce Nolan to cargo, and guarantee resentment. Or he could respect Nolan's judgment so completely that the whole team paid for one man's need to prove himself. Neither choice was responsible. "You walk the flat section with a support strap," Rowan said. "At the ice slope, you use the soft stretcher." Nolan's jaw tightened. Rowan did not raise his voice. "Tiller stays on his own line. Della checks the ground ahead. I remain behind you. We move at the speed your safe leg allows, not the speed the ice demands." For a moment, Nolan looked ready to refuse. Then Tiller stood and pressed his shoulder gently against Nolan's good knee. The mechanic rested one hand on the dog's head. "All right," Nolan said, "but I take the first steps." Della secured the support strap around Nolan's torso. Rowan packed the remaining medicine and transmitter parts they might need for the record. They left the empty tins, broken wire, and old biscuits behind. Nothing else was worth losing the channel. When Rowan opened the shelter door, white light entered across the floor. Beyond the cove, a wide slab of ice had appeared between the cliffs. It moved slowly, but its leading edge already narrowed the dark water through which the skiff had come. Claire's voice returned over the radio. "Once the skiff clears the first rocks, there will be no time to come back for equipment or belongings." Rowan looked at Nolan standing inside the support straps. Tiller waited beside him in the orange flotation vest. Behind them, the stove burned low in the shelter that had kept one man alive after everyone else ran out of places to search. This time, leaving meant taking the missing man with him. Rowan understood that. His hands understood the plan. But somewhere deeper, in the part of him that still listened for Evan through old static, leaving a place of uncertainty felt exactly like abandonment. The distance from shelter MR3 to the rescue skiff was less than 40 yards. On dry ground, Nolan Voss could once have crossed it while carrying an engine block under one arm and complaining that the manufacturer had used the wrong bolts. That morning, the short path had become a field of loose stone, hard snow, and clear ice sloping toward black water. Della Rusk stepped outside first. She tested each section with the heel of her boot and marked the safest line with short lengths of orange cord. Behind her, Nolan stood inside the support strap. The 10 days inside the shelter had taken weight from his face and strength from his legs, but not the need to participate in his own rescue. His injured ankle remained lifted slightly from the floor. Rowan supported him from behind without carrying his full weight. Tiller waited beside Nolan's uninjured leg. The German Shepherd's safety line remained separate from the support strap, exactly as planned. He stayed close without leaning against the swollen ankle or crossing in front of Nolan's feet. Della gave the signal to begin. Nolan took the first step, then another. Each movement required him to place the good foot carefully, shift weight into the strap, and let Rowan steady his upper body. Tiller matched the slow pace without being told. The cove beyond them had changed since their arrival. Ice moved through the narrow entrance in flat gray sections. Some pieces turned gently in the protected water. Others pressed against the rock and cracked with a sound like distant timber breaking. Claire Arden's voice came through Rowan's radio. The rescue commander told them the outer current was pushing a larger ice sheet toward the channel. They still had time, but the margin was shrinking. Rowan acknowledged the message and kept Nolan moving. He did not repeat the entire warning. Nolan could already see the ice. Fear did not need unnecessary detail to do its work. They crossed the first flat stretch. At the base of the slope, Nolan stopped. The incline ahead was only 12 feet long, but ice covered the stone beneath a layer of loose snow. The skiff waited below, tied against the narrow landing. Nolan looked at the soft stretcher Della had unfolded. For a moment, Rowan expected another argument. Instead, Nolan studied the slope, then looked down at his injured ankle. "I will use it here," Nolan said. The decision mattered, because it belonged to him. Della and Rowan did not congratulate him as if he were a child who had finally behaved. They lowered him onto the stretcher, secured the chest and leg straps, and explained each movement before making it. Receiving help did not remove Nolan from the rescue. It allowed him to remain part of it. Tiller watched the process, then moved to the forward position with Della. His leash gave him enough room to turn and check Nolan, but not enough to cross the stretcher's path. Rowan took the rear handles. They began descending. The first 2 steps went cleanly. On the third, a wave entered the cove and struck the outer rock wall. The water did not reach them, but its force traveled through the narrow space. A heavy boom rolled between the cliffs. For Rowan, the sound became something else. Cold stone disappeared. The rescue stretcher beneath his hands became a line stretched through another storm. The cove became the flooded place where Evan Cade had vanished beyond radio range. The water against Morrow Rock became the same water that had once filled every available path and forced Rowan's team to withdraw. His hands tightened around the stretcher handles. His breath shortened. Della continued 1 step before recognizing that the stretcher was no longer moving evenly. She stopped without turning too quickly. Rowan knew where he was. He could name the island, the cove, and every person beside him. His body believed none of it. The old order returned with brutal clarity. Withdraw. Leave the area. Preserve the remaining team. Somewhere behind the command lived Evan's unfinished voice. There's another way, past the... Rowan stared at the ice-covered rock immediately in front of his boots. He could not make his hands release their grip. Tiller turned. Della held the German Shepherd's line, but Tiller stepped back within its safe length. He moved beside Rowan and pressed one shoulder against Rowan's knee. Not enough force to shift his balance, only enough to be felt. Warm fur against waterproof cloth. Living weight in the present. Nolan raised his head from the stretcher. The man being rescued had little strength to spare, yet he recognized the look of someone trapped in a place no one else could see. "You do not have to defeat the sea," Nolan said. "Just get us past the next stone." Rowan looked down. One stone, not the entire slope, not the channel, not Evan. Not every decision that had followed the day he returned without his teammate. Only the dark rock in front of his left boot. Rowan drew one full breath. He moved the stretcher past it. Then Della found the next foothold. Rowan followed. The world returned in pieces. The pull of the stretcher, the scrape of Della's boot, Tiller's breath, the radio at his shoulder, and the pale edge of the skiff below. Grace did not always arrive as courage. Sometimes it arrived as permission to complete one honest action before asking for another. They reached the landing. The rigid rescue skiff had been selected for exactly this load. Nolan was secured low along the center line, where his weight would not unbalance the craft. Della sat forward beside the medical bag. Rowan took the motor controls. Tiller lay beside Nolan's good leg. His harness remained clipped to a separate floor ring, leaving enough space for him to settle without interfering with the stretcher straps. Rowan counted every person and every secured line before releasing the shore rope. No equipment remained that mattered more than leaving safely. The small oil stove, the broken transmitter, and the empty food tins stayed inside MR3. The shelter had carried Nolan through 10 nights. It did not ask anyone to risk an 11th in gratitude. The skiff moved away from shore. Behind them, the wide slab of ice entered the cove. Its edge pressed against the first rocks and rotated slowly into the channel they had used. Rowan kept the motor low and followed the narrow water Hollis had described. Della watched the bow. Tiller remained still beside Nolan. The German shepherd did not look back at the shelter. His attention stayed on the man breathing beside him. When the skiff cleared the first rock, the ice shifted across part of the passage behind them. They would not have been able to return. For years, Rowan had believed that a closing route meant someone had been abandoned on the other side. That morning, the route closed after everyone had passed through. Claire brought the rescue vessel close enough to shelter the skiff from the outer swell. Her crew lowered the lifting system prepared before departure. Nolan was transferred first. The straps supported him evenly as the sea moved beneath both boats. Della climbed aboard next. Tiller followed with a guided harness lift, calm but alert. Rowan came last after securing the skiff for towing. No one returned to Morrow Rock. No one was left there. As the rescue vessel turned toward Driftwood Reach, Claire checked Nolan's condition, while Rowan stood near the cabin door. Tiller rested on a blanket beside his owner, his head across Nolan's boots. The sea behind them remained rough, but it no longer held the whole story. Nolan waited until Claire finished before asking about Evan Cade. Rowan could have refused. Nolan was exhausted and had no right to a complete account of a wound he had discovered only hours earlier. Still, something about the question felt different from curiosity. Nolan had not asked how Evan died. He asked who Evan had been. Rowan described a man who carried extra dry socks because someone else always forgot them. Evan made coffee strong enough to offend the cook and sang old hymns without knowing more than half the words. During their final mission, weather and terrain separated Evan from the team. Rowan remained in the search until continuing would have placed the others beyond recovery. Hours after the withdrawal, a weak signal appeared. No one proved it came from Evan. No one proved it did not. Rowan had spent years living as though uncertainty itself were a conviction. Nolan listened without offering easy forgiveness. When Rowan finished, Nolan looked toward the window and said, "You took something no one could know for certain and used it to sentence the rest of your life." Rowan's first instinct was to defend the decision, then defend the guilt, as if both were parts of the same duty. He did neither. The words did not free him. They simply reached a door he had kept locked and showed him the hinges were still there. Driftwood Reach came into view beneath a clearing sky. People lined the harbor beneath falling snow. They stood along the service pier, outside the clinic entrance, and beside the boat sheds. No one cheered when the rescue vessel docked. The villagers moved back to make room for the medical team. They understood that returning after 10 days was not a performance. Nolan was not proof of their faith or a reward for their grief. He was a tired man coming home. Edith Voss waited near the end of the pier in her navy coat. Her silver lighthouse pin caught the harbor light. When Nolan was brought within reach, Edith did not immediately embrace him. She removed one glove and placed her palm against his cheek. Nolan closed his eyes. Edith held her hand there, long enough to confirm warmth, breath, and the shape of the face she knew. Then she spoke. "You have the right to make your own choices," Edith told him. "You do not have the right to make the people who love you guess where to search." Nolan lowered his gaze. He apologized, not for wanting to repair MR3, and not for believing his work still mattered. He apologized for turning self-respect into silence and leaving no one enough information to help him. Tiller stood between the stretcher and Edith. She rested one hand on his head without looking away from Nolan. Marin Cole approached after the clinic team finished its first examination. The harbor master admitted that her earlier decision had been based on incomplete information. Claire answered before Marin could turn that admission into another punishment. Stopping the first search had been necessary. The weather had exceeded safe limits, a rescue vessel had developed trouble, and no confirmed route led to the sheltered cove. The failure was not that they had returned. The failure was in the system that hid an inactive shelter, ignored a retired station code, and allowed alternate routes to remain unrecorded. By evening, the first changes had already been written down. All secondary routes would be filed before departure. Closed shelters would remain visible on rescue charts. Signals from retired station codes would require human review. Every offshore boat would carry backup communication. Every storm shelter still capable of protecting life would be inspected again. Rowan returned to his cabin after dark. He expected exhaustion to carry him directly to sleep. Instead, he sat near the stove and listened to snow touch the roof. A knock came at the door. Edith stood outside holding the copper tube marked MR3. She had cleaned the salt from it while Nolan rested at the clinic. Beneath the old wax near the base, she discovered a seam too fine to notice before. The bottom of the tube unscrewed. Inside the hidden space was a piece of paper folded many times, its edges yellow but dry. Edith recognized Lydia's handwriting. Rowan opened only the first fold. The message began. To the person who must one day decide when to stop searching, Nolan Voss was still at the Driftwood Reach clinic when Edith opened Lydia's letter. Rowan sat at the small table in his cabin, the copper tube marked MR3 resting between them. Snow pressed softly against the windows. The stove gave off enough heat to warm the paper without making Edith remove her navy coat. She unfolded the letter carefully. Lydia's handwriting was small and steady, written by someone accustomed to fitting clear instructions into narrow spaces. The message had been written years earlier, when Lydia and Nolan still inspected the old storm shelters together. It was not addressed to Nolan by name. It was meant for whoever found it when a hard decision had already been made. Edith read aloud. There are times when rescuers must turn home. There are times when those waiting must continue living without an answer. Do not mistake either choice for proof that nothing remains worth considering. Edith paused and moved her finger to the next line. Leave an empty space on every map for what you do not yet know. Rowan looked at the folded chart on this table. For years, he had treated uncertainty as the most dangerous thing a man could carry. Facts were weight. Procedures were rails. A clear ending allowed people to move forward. But uncertainty had not disappeared when he refused to name it. It had simply followed him into every quiet room. Lydia did not promise that missing people always returned. She did not write that faith could calm every storm or turn every faint signal into a living voice. Her letter was more practical than that. Hope needed a boundary. A search needed a route home. Someone else needed to know where the searcher had gone, and when new facts appeared, pride must not prevent people from examining an old conclusion again. Rowan thought of Evan Cade. The decision to withdraw had not been betrayal. Rowan's team had reached the limit of what could be done without losing more people. No one could honestly say the weak signal recorded later had come from Evan. Rowan's mistake came afterward. He had taken one day he could never resolve and used it to close every door that might make him care deeply again. Edith finished the letter, then folded it along the old creases. Lydia believed the Lord gave people judgment for a reason, Edith said. She also believed judgment should remain humble. Rowan looked toward the dark porch window. Humility did not mean pretending every hope was wise. It meant accepting that a conclusion could be responsible without being eternal. 6 weeks later, winter sunlight spread across Driftwood Reach. Snow covered the village roofs and the high stone ledges, but the sky had cleared to a hard, beautiful blue. North Glass Sound shone beyond the harbor like polished steel. The rescue of Nolan did not turn the island into a place where nothing could go wrong. It turned the island into a place willing to learn. The new volunteer program was called Reach Watch. Marin Cole established a separate fuel reserve for search operations, protected from ordinary harbor use. Every departing boat received a simple voyage card with space for a main route, an alternate route, expected return time, and emergency contact. The cards used large print and clear boxes. Older fishermen had helped design them. No one wanted a safety system that made experienced people feel like children asking permission to leave home. Residents who lived alone received backup radios, but participation did not mean surrendering privacy. They chose who would check on them and how often. The system was built with them, not imposed upon them. Grant Sutter updated the communications software so retired station codes could no longer disappear into an automated low-priority file. Any transmission from an inactive shelter now required a human review. Hollis Dane began meeting younger boat operators near the harbor twice a month. Using his driftwood cane, he drew current patterns in the snow and taught them why the sea around Blackfin could move wreckage one way and a person another. Edith updated the island's historical maps. Shelters that no longer appeared on modern charts were marked in faded red instead of being erased. Claire Arden scheduled a rescue exercise for every season. Morrow Rock received a new transmitter, sealed food, clean blankets, heating fuel, water supplies, and a brighter signal cloth. Nolan supervised the repairs from shore until his ankle healed enough for him to make the trip with a full crew. He did not go alone. That was not defeat. It was the first evidence that he had understood what his silence had cost. Nolan returned to his workshop using a cane for the first few weeks. He still repaired engines, questioned manufacturers' decisions, and refused to organize his tools in any way other people could understand. But before every offshore trip, Nolan completed a voyage card. He no longer treated telling others his route as an invitation for them to control him. It was an acknowledgement that their concern had dignity too. Lydia's brass whistle hung beside the chart of Morrow Rock. Beneath it, Nolan mounted a small wooden frame containing a copy of her letter. The original remained with Edith. Rowan began visiting the workshop every Thursday. At first, he and Nolan spoke only about practical things. They discussed worn cables, fuel mixtures, corroded fittings, and the correct way to winterize an engine block. Tiller usually lay between them near the stove. Over time, silence stopped being the only safe language in the room. Nolan began speaking about Lydia as a living woman, rather than only someone he had lost. He told Rowan how she once burned 3 loaves of bread while arguing that a lighthouse log had been filed incorrectly. He remembered the way she laughed before she admitted a mistake, and how she could hear a weak engine belt from across the harbor. Rowan began speaking about Evan the same way. He told Nolan that Evan sang old hymns with great confidence and almost no correct words. He made coffee so strong that the other men accused him of trying to clean engine parts with it. He carried extra dry socks because someone else always forgot to pack enough. The memories changed shape as Rowan spoke them aloud. Evan was no longer only a voice cut off by static. He became a friend again. Rowan's sleep did not become perfect. Some nights, wind moved through the cabin wall and sounded like radio interference. Sometimes Rowan woke with his hands tight around the blanket and his breathing too shallow, but he no longer sat alone until morning. On certain nights, Tiller slept outside the bedroom door. Nolan sometimes arrived with a damaged part he claimed could not wait until daylight. Edith brought coffee and corrected Rowan's understanding of lighthouse history, whether he asked or not. Rowan began leaving the porch lamp on when he knew someone was coming. The change was small enough that no one called it healing. That made it honest. One afternoon, Rowan rewrote the personal checklist he used for coastal work. The form already included weather, fuel, crew, communications, equipment, and the mandatory route home. At the bottom, he added one final box. Unexamined possibility. The words did not mean every possibility deserved pursuit. They meant no conclusion should hide the limits of the information behind it. Nolan read the new line over Rowan's shoulder. "That box will get you into arguments," Nolan said. Rowan folded the form and placed it in his coat. "Then I will file the arguments before departure." Nolan gave a short laugh. It was the first time Rowan had heard him laugh, without grief, standing directly behind it. Later that afternoon, the fog bell moved in the harbor wind. 3 short notes passed across Driftwood Reach. Tiller lifted his head from his front paws. Months earlier, the same rhythm had sent him toward the door, the harbor, and every place where Nolan's absence might still be waiting. Now Nolan sat at the workbench, rebuilding a carburetor. His copper-gray hair had grown back into its usual disorder, and Lydia's wedding ring rested beneath his shirt on the old leather cord. Rowan stood near the stove, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. Tiller looked at Nolan. Then the German shepherd turned his amber eyes toward Rowan. No one gave a command. Tiller lowered his head onto his paws and closed his eyes. He had found the man he had waited for. In doing so, Tiller had helped another man understand that being found did not always mean being pulled from black water. Sometimes being found meant living where someone would notice an empty chair. Sometimes it meant leaving a route behind. Sometimes it meant allowing another person to help carry the part of the map that remained uncertain. Beyond the workshop window, snow shone on the roofs of Driftwood Reach. Far across North Glass Sound, Morrow Rock was only a narrow black line beneath the clear winter sky. Rowan had not learned to hope blindly. He had learned to hold hope with both hands. One hand held the facts. The other held the people those facts were meant to protect. For the first time in years, Rowan no longer felt as though he were guarding a door that had already closed. He was sitting in a warm room with Nolan nearby, Tiller sleeping between them, and a porch light waiting outside. If Rowan ever failed to return, someone would know he was missing. Someone would know where to begin. Sometimes faith does not mean searching forever. Sometimes it means preparing carefully, listening humbly, and leaving room for what we do not yet know. Rowan learned that hope becomes dangerous only when it walks alone. With truth, limits, and people willing to stand beside us, hope can become a path home. Perhaps there is an empty space on your own map today, a question without an answer, a relationship not yet healed, or a prayer that seems to have gone quiet. May God give you wisdom for the next step and peace while you wait. Tell us what Tiller, Rowan, and Nolan's journey meant to you in the comments. If stories of loyalty, faith, and second chances encourage you, please subscribe and join us again. May you always have someone who notices when your chair is empty.